Hey everyone, thanks for your time. I'm back from New Orleans, and the SLS Core Stage for Artemis II is en route to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida this weekend. The delivery of the stage is one of the big Artemis news items of the week, but there was also a note about the big picture for Artemis II that I got in New Orleans for the rollout, and I'll also start reviewing the factory tour of the Michoud Assembly Facility that we got after the stage went past. And there were also a few other items in the news feed for the week, so let's dig into a little bit of that. Over the past few days, NASA Public Affairs has continued to release more still images and edited video taken on Tuesday, July 16th, during the rollout of Core Stage 2 at the Michoud Assembly Facility factory and onto the agency's Pegasus barge. The barge is on the way to Kennedy Space Center in Florida, but progress of the ocean voyage is being kept relatively quiet. Media at the rollout event got to see the initial movement of the stage on the NASA Multipurpose Transportation System, or MPTS, which was being moved by the agency's Overland Self-Propelled Modular Transporters, or SPMTs. A move team from Boeing, the prime contractor for SLS stages, backed the stage out of the transfer aisle of Building 110, also known as the Vertical Assembly Building, or Michoud's VAB. Footage released by NASA provides other vantage points for that, along with the sweeping counterclockwise turn in the tarmac area to start the move out of the factory. While we stayed in the tarmac area, the move team pressed ahead with transferring the stage to the barge. NASA has started to provide views of the rest of the move on the surface streets of the facility down to the dock where Pegasus was. From the Building 103 complex, they first turned left onto Venus Drive, then turned right onto Saturn Boulevard, which winds its way to the dock. Stills and edited video shot from the ground and from aerial drones show different points during the move, including the roll onto the barge. This was not shown in the pictures, but after the MPTS was lined up with pedestals that it would sit on, the SPMTs lowered the carriers down so that they could be bolted into the pedestals. Once the carriers holding the stage were secured to the barge, the SPMTs were repositioned on the deck, and both the carriers and the SPMTs were secured to D-rings that are all along the Pegasus deck. A portable purge unit was also brought on the trip to keep the engines and the compartments on the stage air-conditioned. Artemis II crew members, Commander Reid, Wiseman, and Mission Specialist Jeremy Hansen took some pictures with the stage during the transport, after the convoy had turned onto Saturn Boulevard. They participated in a short media question session earlier back on the tarmac. I asked them about the addition of NASA astronaut Andre Douglas to the team, who will be the NASA backup crew member, along with Canadian Space Agency backup crew member Jenny Gibbons, who has been training for several months. Here's that question and the response from Reid Wiseman. You just added Andre to your training crew. Yeah. How's that going to go? You have now 6 to train on the ground.
We love it. We love having Jenny Gibbons on our crew and adding Andre. Now we feel like we're complete. We had that missing element, and now we know who our final backup crew member is, and we're ready to go. We were with Andre all day yesterday. His very first act was to walk into Howard Hughes' office, our program manager, and sit down for a meeting, and he wasted no time. He went right in with questions that were curious on his mind, and we love having that fresh perspective. We just hired him in 2021. He's a good friend, and we're really encouraged. And he's a Coast Guard background, a lot of operational experience, and a brilliant engineer. So really happy to have him on the crew.
Thank you. Interestingly enough, at the same time that some of the core stage rollout pictures started showing up on the NASA imagery site, a larger set of still images also began to populate of the June 28th transfer of the Artemis II Orion spacecraft from its processing cell to the altitude chamber for testing. Initially, there was some thought that the lack of images released was due to disclosure restrictions, since the crew module in particular was configured a little differently for the vacuum test in the altitude chamber versus the electromagnetic interference and compatibility testing that was conducted in April. Some of the back shells and other coverings on the crew module were not installed for the vacuum testing. So, for example, we can see that the hatch is missing a flight cover. The European Space Agency published a blog on Thursday, July 18th about the testing, and there were a couple of notes about the status. It says that Orion remained at low pressure in the chamber for about a week, and that the chamber was repressurized after that, and a post-vacuum performance check was conducted. but it doesn't say whether the spacecraft has returned to its processing cell to continue final assembly in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at the Kennedy Space Center. The blog also notes at the bottom that the solar array wings are now expected to be attached, quote, after the summer. If we take that literally, that means that Orion handover to Exploration Ground Systems would likely be no earlier than the October, early fall timeframe. But it's also possible EGS handover could be later than that. KSC Public Affairs posted a blog on Friday, July 19th, summarizing the completion of integrated systems verification and validation testing of the ignition overpressure protection sound suppression water systems, both on the Pad 39B side and the Mobile Launcher 1 side. Most of the water flows were conducted last year. As noted in the travel video I posted on the night of the rollout, there was a brief opportunity for media to ask questions of Jim Free, NASA's Associate Administrator, and Amit Kshatriya, the head of the Moon to Mars Program Office under NASA's Human Exploration Directorate. The dozen or so of us media got about 10 minutes to squeeze in questions to both of them, and at the end I was able to ask Mr. Kshatriya about the big picture for the Artemis II schedule. Basically, when will they decide to start stacking the vehicle on Mobile Launcher 1 once it gets back to the VAB? The stacking would begin with the SLS boosters. For a little bit more background there, back in mid-April, Exploration Directorate head Catherine Kerner noted, in a response to an Inspector General report, that the Moon to Mars program would conduct a checkpoint before beginning stacking. She noted, quote, "This checkpoint will evaluate the status of hardware and software across M2M, Moon to Mars, including design changes, verification and validation testing, operational changes, anomaly resolutions, and limited life items. It will determine if M2M is prepared to begin stacking operations, considering any ongoing work and outstanding risks," unquote. So on July 16th at the rollout, I asked Mr. Kshatriya for an update on when that checkpoint review meeting was currently expected to take place. Here's that audio.
You guys talked about having a Moon to Mars, like a stacking checkpoint at some point eventually.
Yeah.
Kind of, where are you, and is Orion kind of the thing that's feeding into that in terms of the timing of that?
Well, there's a lot of things that factor into that stacking decision. Of course, once we get the boosters up, we start a clock on the migration of the propellants. So we need to make sure we do that smartly and kind of manage that with the processing of the spacecraft. So we're looking like September is kind of when we're going to make that decision.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're getting there. We're trying to process the vehicle. Of course, you're familiar. I think based on the intent of your questions, kind of where we are with the investigations all over the place.
Yeah,
with that low, et cetera. It's going well. They're working really hard, but yeah, all roads kind of heading to that mid-September timeframe.
Okay, for your meeting.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
We still need to see when Mobile Launcher 1 rolls back from Pad 39B to High Bay 3 of the VAB at Kennedy Space Center, and there's been no update on that beyond mid-summer. But a mid-September checkpoint meeting could support the timeframes we previously heard from NASA Administrator Senator Bill Nelson of summer to start booster stacking and then mating the core stage to the boosters in the fall. That would translate to the end of the summer or the end of September. Of course, that's only if they decide to proceed with stacking at that point. We still need to see when the meeting occurs and what they decide to do when it happens. In the meantime, we'll continue to watch for updates on the Orion heat shield investigation and the next milestones for the rest of the summer, and now potentially with Orion final assembly into the fall. As a quick footnote, on Friday, July 19th, NASA posted a low-resolution shot of Pegasus departing Michoud under tow and push by tugboats. The plan was for the barge to depart the morning after the rollout on the 17th. Around mid-morning on rollout day, with the stage move going faster than anticipated, our tram tour of the Building 103 complex got started early. NASA and Boeing SLS officials took VIPs, visitors, and media around the facility in groups throughout the morning. With the second core stage complete and literally just exited the building, on our tour we saw most of the core stage hardware still in production for the third and fourth builds. We also saw some exploration upper stage hardware and also got a look at the pieces of the Orion pressure vessel for Artemis V. We weren't able to take pictures of everything, but we were able to see almost everything and get a verbal update on the other pieces. So here are some takeaways from the tour combined with status. The next core stage in assembly is Core Stage 3, which would be pointed at Artemis 3, of course. The overall takeaway is that meaningful progress was made since the last sightings we had. Put another way, it seems like Boeing is staying within shouting distance of the schedule, at least relatively speaking. Here's the status of the major elements which are still being outfitted individually. The engine section is one of the critical paths, and it's already in Florida, so we didn't get much of an update on that. But we saw the boat tail, which is ready to be shipped to KSC. That's in storage essentially, and the inner tank and forward skirt elements may be nearing readiness for the forward join, in which case they would similarly sit in storage. We didn't see the liquid hydrogen tank, last seen going into cell P for primer sprays last November. Chandler Sherman with NASA's SLS program showed us around the facility, and he said that the tank is now in cell N getting ready for the application of spray-on foam insulation. That means that primer sprays were completed sometime in the intervening months. We just didn't get any pictures indicating that. The liquid oxygen tank is the other critical path for the Artemis III Core Stage build at this point. It fell behind due to issues with a welding tool that lasted most of 2023. But major welding was completed early this year, and the tank was finally removed from the Vertical Assembly Center welding tool in early February. We got a very brief glimpse of the tank, which is currently in Area 6. Non-destructive evaluations of the tank welds are being performed after the tank was hydrostatically proof tested in Cell F. So in between February and now, the tank received plug welds in Area 6, went through a first set of phased array ultrasonic NDE testing, went through the proof test in Cell F, and now is back in Area 6 for post-proof NDE. The next steps after that would be to go to Cell E for internal cleaning, and then to Cell P for its primer sprays, and then eventually to Cell N for its foam sprays. In the last visit to Michoud in October, the estimate was that the forward join of the inner tank, LOX tank, and forward skirt could begin by the end of this year, 2024, and given the progress with the LOX tank, that at least still seems realistic. The overall forecast for completion of the stage, which will be in the VAB in Florida, is 2025. That gives Boeing a little less than a year and a half, which is probably optimistic, but they are at least keeping up with production of the top 4/5 of the stage. We're still going to be watching to see when the forward join starts and how close that is to the end of this year or early next. The engine section is the other critical path, and status for that is more difficult to obtain. I asked another NASA official, Greg Eldridge, about critical paths, and the way I interpreted his response was that the engine section and LOX tank are still neck and neck for the primary critical path for the build. For Core Stage 4, the overall takeaway is that production is also pressing forward. The most obvious indication of that was that Boeing was pressing ahead with some outfitting work on the engine section. I've heard the phrase pre-integration used in the past, and this seems something like that. Structural assembly is complete, and the structure was ready to move to KSC to begin integration in the spring. However, the delay to Artemis II and III announced at the beginning of the year had a domino effect on planning schedules for infrastructure maintenance. That meant that the Core Stage 4 engine section was going to spend a lot more of 2024 at Michoud. We couldn't take any pictures of it, but it was obvious that NASA and Boeing decided to press ahead with some integration work in New Orleans rather than stop. The other surprise was also to see that the boat tail assembly for Core Stage 4 was already well underway, right next to the completed boat tail for Core Stage 3. I had seen some fairing pieces in storage last October that I thought were the outside engine fairings for Core Stage 2, but those may have been pieces of the Core Stage 4 boat tail which are now being put together. That's another indication that NASA and Boeing are pressing ahead with Core Stage 4 production. The engine section is typically the critical path, so continuing with outfitting at least keeps options open for now by keeping up with a sooner than later completion date schedule. At some point, though, the rest of the stage will need to be assembled. The next most critical element is the inner tank, and it's still in the structural assembly jig. When the structure is complete, it would go to Cell G for application of its spray-on foam insulation. But the rest of the stage still needs to be welded in the vertical assembly center. The forward skirt is somewhere in storage, we did not see that, but it needs its two L-rings welded to the top and the bottom of the barrel. but there's only one integration stand for both the inner tank and forward skirt, and those are occupied right now by the Core Stage 3 elements. The barrels and domes for the two propellant tanks are nearing completion. We saw the forward dome for the LH2 tank in the circumferential dome welding tool. The gore body to Y-ring weld had already been completed and the end cap was loaded into the tool. Right now, the VAC, which would be needed to put the barrels and domes together, is being used to help finish exploration upper stage development, so it's occupied. Core Stage 4 is assigned to Artemis IV, of course, which is the first Block 1B vehicle. As long as that's the case, assembly of the EUS structural test article and the flight article are the overall critical path for the Artemis IV SLS. So one thing to watch is when the propellant tanks for Core Stage 4 are welded in the VAC. For EUS, the Weld Confidence LH2 tank dome was loaded into the VAC, but it was hanging in the tool. It doesn't look like the first of two confidence welds that need to be executed in the tool is imminent. The first would be a dome to barrel weld, and that would be followed by a barrel to L-ring weld. Back in the area with the dome welding tools, we did see and were also able to image gore panels being loaded into the gore weld tool. These are for the EUS qualification article, which will eventually be assembled into the STA. So that tool, along with the vertical weld center in Building 115, are certified for EUS welds. But the disposition of the other weld tools at MAF is not clear. The officials available during the tram tour were core stage oversight and so didn't have as high level of insight into that status. The LOX Tank Assembly Center tool, or LTAC, appeared to be empty and not busy. Work was being performed on the EUS Circumferential Dome Welding Tool, CDWT No. 2, also known as Universal Weld Station No. 1. The certification status for those two tools is not known, and the confidence welds still will need to be performed in the VAC before they can be analyzed and that tool can be certified. So at the halfway point of 2024, those three may still need to be cleared to begin welding STA and flight article panels into barrels and domes for both the EUS LH2 and LOX tanks. The last sort of non-aspirational forecast I heard was for the EUS STA to be completed in the summer of next year, 2025. The last official update was in the FY 2025 President's Budget Request materials, which were released in March. I'm not sure when the text for that was written, but it said that the STA would be completed in this fiscal year 2024, which ends in 2 months at the end of September. That was aspirational back in March, if not impossible back then, but it's definitely impossible now. Lockheed Martin also welds and fabricates Orion structures at Michoud, and given the dignitaries at MAF for the rollout ceremony, some elements of the Artemis V pressure vessel were on display and we were allowed to take imagery. In the foreground is the cone of the pressure vessel, which is welded from 3 panels. In the back are the aft bulkhead and barrel upside down, which have also been welded. This is a graphic from the Orion program showing the 7 major welds for the pressure vessel. Based on this visit and the previous one last October, welds 1 through 5 have been completed. I asked about the backbone assembly, which will need to be installed inside the barrel aft bulkhead assembly before the last weld, labeled number 7 here, can be performed, but the backbone was said to still be outside being worked on. Last October we saw the tunnel and forward bulkhead, which had already been welded. Those were also not seen this time. I also asked if there was any Artemis II Orion launch abort system hardware still at Michoud, and it was said that the ogive panels are still being processed there. Those are practically the last pieces to be assembled on Orion before it goes to the VAB to be stacked on top of SLS, so they are not needed at KSC until sometime next year. There were a couple of other notes via social media posts on Friday, July 19th. First, the European Space Agency made a series of posts in the middle of the 55th anniversary of Apollo 11 that we're in right now, saying that ESM-3 will travel to KSC this summer. But it wasn't specific, so this may have been more about the Apollo 11 anniversary. The last update for ESM-3 transportation was that it would be on dock at KSC in July. So does this post mean that it's going to ship before the end of the month? Or does it mean it could ship as late as September? The picture with the post is also not of ESM-3. So again, an indication that maybe this was more an anniversary post than anything. A more relevant picture was posted by Maxar on LinkedIn, showing the lift of a propellant tank into the center cylinder of the gateway power and propulsion element. The post says that the xenon and bipropellant/hypergolic tanks are now all installed, which would be a milestone. We're still waiting to see when the solar electric propulsion thrusters are delivered and installed next year, and also how qualification testing being run in parallel is progressing on those thrusters. Still no update on a target launch date for the initial gateway elements. So that's the end of the week. I had planned to make a second cross-country trip from here in the Los Angeles area out to Florida for the core stage arrival at Kennedy Space Center, but those plans fell through. Travel is expensive, so I will save my budget for a better opportunity at another time. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative.